The ping was faint at first, just a soft metallic echo rippling through the hydrophones, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of the Atlantic. The operator aboard HMS Starling adjusted his headphones, closed his eyes, and listened harder. There, again, clearer this time. A definite return. Something solid down there in the dark water. Something metal. Something trying very hard not to be found. "Contact," he said quietly. "Bearing 270, range 1,200 yards." It was February 1944, the North Atlantic 300 miles west of Ireland. The water was black and freezing. The sky overcast, visibility less than a mile. Perfect conditions for a U-boat to hide. Except this U-boat wasn't hidden. Not anymore. The commander of HMS Starling, Captain Frederick Walker, leaned over the ASDIC operator's shoulder and listened to the pings. Each one sent out into the water, each one bouncing back, each return slightly different, slightly stronger, giving away the submarine's position depth, even its heading. Walker smiled. Not a pleasant smile. The kind of smile a hunter wears when the prey doesn't know it's been spotted. "Designate target," he said calmly. "Load depth charges. Prepare for attack." The U-boat crew had no idea what was coming. Because they couldn't hear the pings, couldn't detect the sonar pulses bouncing off their hull, couldn't know that hundreds of feet above them British sailors were tracking their every movement through sound alone. They were blind, and the Allies had learned to see in the dark. In 1939, the U-boat was king of the Atlantic. German submarines prowled the shipping lanes between Britain and North America, sinking merchant vessels faster than the Allies could build them. Convoys sailed into the darkness and simply disappeared. Hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors, gone without a trace. The British called it the Atlantic Gap, a stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats operated with near impunity. Down there in the cold, black depths, submarines were nearly invisible. Surface ships could search for days and find nothing. Visual detection required luck and good weather. Most of the time, the first sign of a U-boat was the torpedo strike. By 1940, Britain was starving. Not metaphorically, literally. Food imports were being cut to the bone. Fuel was scarce. The island was slowly being strangled by submarines that could hunt, freely strike without warning, and vanish before anyone could respond. Churchill said it plainly. "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." And then the scientists turned sound into a weapon. The technology wasn't new. Sonar, though the British called it ASDIC, had been in development since World War I. The basic principle was simple. Send out a pulse of sound underwater. If it hits something solid, it bounces back. Measure the time delay, calculate the distance. Physics 101. But making it work in practice was brutally difficult. Sound behaves strangely underwater. It bends with temperature gradients, reflects off density layers, gets absorbed by biologics. Schools of fish could look like submarines. Thermal layers could hide submarines completely, and the equipment itself in the early days was primitive, unreliable, prone to false readings. Before the war, ASDIC was considered experimental, promising but unproven. The Royal Navy had it installed on some escort vessels, but most commanders didn't trust it. They relied on eyes, on lookouts scanning the horizon with binoculars. The U-boats massacred them. By 1940, it was clear that something had to change. Eyes weren't enough. Luck wasn't enough. If Britain was going to survive, they needed a way to find submarines before the torpedoes were already in the water. They needed to hunt in the dark. The breakthrough came in pieces. Better hydrophones, more sensitive receivers, improved signal processing, training programs that taught operators to distinguish real contacts from false echoes, tacticians who developed attack patterns optimized for ASDIC-guided depth charge runs. But the real game changer was integration. ASDIC didn't work alone. It worked as part of a system: radar to detect surfaced U-boats, direction-finding equipment to track radio transmissions, intelligence from decrypted German communications, aircraft with searchlights and depth charges, and increasingly escort groups that worked together, coordinating their attacks, boxing submarines in. By 1942, the technology was mature enough to be deadly. And by 1943, it was winning the war. Lieutenant Hans Meckel didn't believe the reports at first. He was the commander of U-185, a Type WWII U-boat operating in the North Atlantic. Veteran crew, successful patrols, multiple kills. They knew how to hunt convoys, how to evade escorts, how to survive. But something had changed. In the spring of 1943, Meckel started hearing stories from other U-boat commanders, tales of Allied escorts that seemed to know exactly where the submarines were, ships that would steam straight toward submerged U-boats and drop depth charges with impossible accuracy, attacks that came out of nowhere, even when the U-boat was silent, drifting invisible. The other commanders called it magic. British witchcraft. Meckel called it superstition, until it happened to him. May 1943. U-185 was stalking a convoy southwest of the Azores. Standard tactics: submerged approach during daylight, surface at night to recharge batteries, and close distance for a torpedo attack. They never made it to torpedo range. The escorts found them. While they were submerged, while they were silent and running on battery power at minimal speed, the British destroyers turned toward them and charged. Meckel ordered evasive maneuvers: dive deeper, change heading, go silent, the old tricks that always worked. They didn't work. The destroyers followed, not searching randomly, not guessing, following, like they could see through 300 feet of ocean water. The depth charges came in patterns, clusters of explosions walking across U-185's position, close enough that the hull plates buckled, close enough that lights shattered and men screamed and seawater started spraying through cracked gaskets. Meckel brought the boat up to periscope depth, desperate, trying to figure out what was happening. Through the scope, he saw the British destroyer maybe 600 yards away, turning, maneuvering, like it was reacting to his movements in real time. Impossible. He crash-dived, went deep. The explosions followed him down. U-185 survived that encounter. Barely. Limped back to port with a cracked pressure hull and a crew that no longer believed they were invisible. Meckel filed his report, described the engagement, the impossible accuracy, the way the British seemed to track them underwater. The German naval intelligence officers read the report and went pale. Because Meckel wasn't the first. He wasn't even the 10th. The reports had been piling up for months. U-boats being found while submerged, being tracked while silent, being destroyed by escorts that shouldn't have been able to see them. The British had something, some technology, some method, and it was killing U-boats at an alarming rate. Admiral Karl Dönitz commanded the U-boat fleet. He was brilliant, ruthless, one of the finest naval tacticians in history. He'd developed the wolf pack tactics that turned lone submarines into coordinated hunter groups. He'd nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic through sheer operational genius. But by mid-1943, he was losing. The numbers told the story. In May 1943 alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. 41. In a single month. The U-boat force was being decimated faster than German shipyards could replace them. Experienced crews were dying. New crews were being sent out with minimal training and never coming back. Dönitz held emergency meetings with his staff, with engineers, with intelligence officers, trying to understand what had changed. They had theories. Better radar, obviously. The Allies had developed centimetric radar that could detect even a U-boat's periscope or snorkel. That explained daytime attacks, nighttime interceptions. But it didn't explain the submerged attacks, the times when U-boats were deep, silent, and still being found. One of the junior intelligence officers suggested something radical. What if they can hear us? The room went silent. Not radio, the officer continued. Sound, underwater. What if they're using sound waves to find us the way radar uses radio waves? Dönitz considered it. The Germans had experimented with similar technology, underwater acoustics, but they'd dismissed it as impractical. Too many variables, too much interference. The ocean was too noisy, too chaotic. But what if the British had solved those problems? Find out, Dönitz ordered. Whatever they're using, I want to know how it works, and I want countermeasures, now. The problem for the Germans was simple. They were already losing. By the time they understood what ASDIC was and how it worked, the Allies had refined it to devastating effectiveness. British and Canadian escort groups were hunting U-boats with systematic precision. American destroyer escorts joined the effort, bringing fresh ships and crews. Long-range aircraft covered the Atlantic Gap, making it impossible for U-boats to surface safely. The submarines that had once been predators became prey. And ASDIC was the key. It allowed escorts to maintain contact with submerged U-boats even in terrible weather, even at night, even when visual detection was impossible. The sonar operator would track the submarine's movements, calling out range and bearing updates. The ship would maneuver into position. Depth charges would roll off the stern or be fired from throwers, creating a pattern of explosions that bracketed the target. If the first attack didn't kill the submarine, ASDIC would relocate it, track it again, guide the second attack, and the third. And as many as it took. U-boats couldn't shake ASDIC through evasion, couldn't outrun it. The only defense was to go deep below the thermal layers, where sound behaved unpredictably, and hope the escorts lost contact. Sometimes it worked. Usually it didn't. U-185 went down in August 1943, sunk by American aircraft north of the Azores. Hans Meckel and his entire crew were killed. The U-boat that had survived the ASDIC guided attack in May lasted 3 more months before the ocean finally claimed it. By then, the Atlantic had become a graveyard. Over 700 U-boats were lost during the war, most of them after 1942 when ASDIC and radar and improved tactics turned the hunter into the hunted. German submariners had one of the highest casualty rates of any military branch in World War II. 3 out of every 4 U-boat crew members died at sea. They fought bravely, fought desperately, but they were fighting blind against an enemy that could see them perfectly. The technical details of ASDIC remained classified for decades. The British didn't want potential enemies knowing exactly how their submarine detection worked. Even after the war, when the technology became widespread and the Soviets developed their own sonar systems, the specific operational parameters stayed secret. But the basic mechanics were straightforward. A transducer mounted on the escort vessel's hull would emit a focused pulse of sound, typically in the 20 to 30 kHz range, well above human hearing. The pulse would travel through the water at roughly 1/500 meters per second. When it hit something solid, a submarine's hull, for example, it would reflect back. The hydrophones would pick up the echo. The operator would note the time delay. Simple math gave you the range. The bearing came from the direction of the return signal. With practice, skilled operators could determine not just where the submarine was, but how deep it was, which direction it was moving, even sometimes what type of submarine it was based on the acoustic signature. It was like echolocation, the way bats navigate in caves, except weaponized and lethal. The Germans did develop countermeasures. Rubber coatings on U-boat hulls to absorb sonar pulses. Bold canisters, metal cylinders filled with chemicals that would fizz and create false echoes when released from a submarine. Tactics for hiding in thermal layers or close to the ocean floor where the sonar returns were confused. Some of it worked, some of the time. But by 1943, the Allies were sinking U-boats faster than these countermeasures could be implemented. And for every German innovation, the British refined their technology further. Better signal processing, pattern recognition, experience-based training that taught operators to distinguish real contacts from decoys. The technological race was over before it really began. Captain Frederick Walker became the most successful U-boat hunter of the war. His escort group centered around HMS Starling and operating primarily in the western approaches sank 25 U-boats. 25. Walker personally commanded attacks on at least 6 of them using ASDIC to methodically hunt down submarines that thought they were safe. His tactics were brutally simple. Gain contact, maintain contact, never let go. Track the submarine for hours if necessary. Wait for it to make a mistake to come up for air to speed up and make noise to expose itself. Then attack with overwhelming force. Walker developed the creeping attack, a technique where one ship held ASDIC contact, while another approached slowly and silently to drop depth charges directly over the submarine's position. The U-boat couldn't hear the attack ship coming because it was moving too slowly to make cavitation noise. By the time they realized what was happening, the depth charges were already falling. It was devastatingly effective. Walker's crews called him Johnny. The U-boat crews called him something else, something unprintable. Because if Walker's group picked up your scent, you were probably dead. There's a recording from 1944. Audio captured on HMS Starling during a U-boat hunt. You can hear the ASDIC operator calling out contacts, the mechanical ping of the sonar pulse, the echo, the range calculations. Contact, bearing 295, range 1,000 yards. Ping, echo. Contact firm, range 800 yards, target moving left to right. Ping, echo. Range 500 yards, contact sharp, recommend immediate attack. The methodical, almost bored tone. This was routine by then. Just another submarine. Just another kill. The recording cuts off before the depth charges detonate, but the after-action report shows the submarine U-264 was destroyed with all hands lost. Listening to that recording now is chilling, because what you're hearing is the sound of invisibility being stripped away, of the ocean becoming transparent, of submarines that thought they were hidden suddenly being completely, utterly, fatally visible. The U-boat crews knew they were dying. By 1944, survival rates for new U-boats on their first patrol were below 50%. New commanders were being sent out with minimal training. Boats were being rushed into service with inexperienced crews. The veterans, the ones who'd survived the early years, were almost all dead. Some of them wrote letters home, diaries, memoirs that were never published. The psychological toll is evident in every page. They describe the terror of being hunted underwater, the claustrophobia of knowing something up there can see you, the helplessness of running silent, barely breathing, while depth charges walk across your position, the awful sound of hull plates buckling, water spraying, men screaming, and worst of all, the confusion. Because they couldn't understand how the Allies were doing it, how the escorts always knew where they were, how the attacks were so precise. Some thought it was radar that worked underwater. Some thought the British had spies in every U-boat. Some genuinely believed it was supernatural. The truth was almost worse. It was just physics, sound waves, and mathematics. Technology refined into a weapon that made the ocean itself a trap. The Battle of the Atlantic turned in May 1943. Historians point to that month as the inflection point. That's when U-boat losses exceeded new construction. When Dönitz was forced to withdraw submarines from the North Atlantic temporarily. When it became clear that Germany couldn't win the tonnage war. ASDIC wasn't the only factor. Radar mattered. Aircraft mattered. Code breaking mattered enormously. The Allies were reading German naval communications for much of the war. Escort carriers improved convoy tactics. Better training, all of it contributed. But ASDIC was the foundation. Without the ability to detect submerged submarines, none of the other advantages would have mattered as much. The U-boats could have simply stayed deep, avoided aircraft, and waited for opportunities. ASDIC took away that option, made staying submerged just as dangerous as surfacing, turned the ocean from a hiding place into a hunting ground. The technology evolved after the war. Modern naval sonar is vastly more sophisticated than wartime ASDIC. Digital signal processing, towed arrays, active and passive modes, systems that can track multiple contacts, simultaneously classify them, predict their movements. But the basic principle remains the same. Send out sound, listen for the echo, find what's hidden. The U-boats never really stood a chance once that technology matured. They were fighting physics. And physics doesn't negotiate. There's a memorial in Germany, at Miltenort, overlooking the Kiel Fjord. It commemorates the 30,000 German submariners who died during World War II. Rows and rows of names carved into stone, most of them young, most of them drowned in the Atlantic, Pacific, Mediterranean. Many of them killed by technology they never fully understood. Visitors to the memorial sometimes ask guides how so many submarines were sunk. The usual answer mentions air power, improved tactics, intelligence failures. But the real answer is simpler. The Allies learned to turn sound into a weapon. And once they did, the ocean stopped being a refuge. It became a tomb. Captain Frederick Walker died in July 1944. Not from enemy action, from exhaustion. He'd been at sea almost continuously for 3 years, hunting U-boats, pushing himself and his crews to the limit. His heart gave out. He was 48 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of sailors, men who'd served under him, men whose lives he'd saved by keeping the U-boats at bay, men who understood that Walker's obsessive, relentless hunting had helped turn the tide of the war. At the service, one of his officers said something that stuck. He taught us to see in the dark, and when we learned that we couldn't lose. The German scientists who eventually studied captured ASDIC equipment after the war were impressed. Not by the complexity, the technology was actually relatively simple by late war standards. They were impressed by the execution, by how well the British had integrated the technology into their tactics, by how thoroughly they'd trained operators, by how effective the system became when used properly. One German naval engineer reviewing ASDIC documentation in 1946 wrote in his notes, "We knew sound could be used for detection. We simply didn't believe it could be made reliable enough to matter. That was our mistake. The British believed it could work, and they made it work, and it killed us." There's a strange epilogue to the story. In the 1960s, a group of former U-boat commanders met with a group of former British escort commanders at a naval conference. Professional respect decades after the war. No animosity, just old warriors swapping stories. One of the German officers asked about ASDIC, how it worked, how they'd never been able to shake it effectively. A British commander who'd served on escorts in the Atlantic explained the basics. The sound pulses, the echoes, the tracking. The German officer listened, nodded, and finally said, "We were obsolete and didn't know it. The moment you had that technology working, we'd already lost. We just kept fighting for 2 more years because we didn't understand that yet." The British commander thought about it. "You would have done the same to us if the positions were reversed?" "Yes," the German said. "We would have." They shook hands. The U-boat war was one of the most brutal campaigns in military history. Thousands of ships sunk, tens of thousands of sailors drowned. The cold, dark water of the Atlantic swallowing men by the hundreds, week after week, month after month. And in the middle of it all, this quiet technological revolution. Sound waves bouncing through the ocean. Operators with headphones listening to echoes. Mathematics being turned into targeting data. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't cinematic. Just methodical, patient, relentless hunting. But it worked. By the end of the war, the U-boat threat was broken. Not because the submarines got worse, not because the crews stopped fighting, but because the Allies had fundamentally changed the nature of submarine warfare. They'd made the invisible visible. And once that happened, the outcome was inevitable. Today, every navy in the world uses sonar. Active sonar for hunting. Passive sonar for surveillance. Systems so sophisticated they can track submarines from hundreds of miles away, distinguish between different types of vessels, even identify individual ships by their acoustic signature. But it all goes back to those early ASDIC systems, to the operators in the Atlantic learning to interpret echoes, to the engineers refining the technology, to the tacticians figuring out how to turn sound detection into killing effectiveness. World War II was full of technological innovations, radar, jet engines, nuclear weapons. All of them changed warfare forever. But ASDIC might have been the most important one. Because it saved Britain, kept the supply lines open, made D-Day possible, allowed the Allies to win the tonnage war that Churchill knew they had to win. All by turning sound into a weapon. There's one more story worth telling. In 1947, a former ASDIC operator visited Germany. Tourism, mostly. Curiosity about the country he'd spent 3 years fighting against. He ended up in Hamburg, found a bar where former U-boat sailors gathered. He didn't advertise who he was, didn't mention his service, just sat quietly drinking beer, listening to them talk. They talked about the war, about lost friends, about the terror of being hunted underwater, about the escorts that always seemed to know where they were. One of them, an old man who'd survived 4 patrols, said something that made the British veterans' blood run cold. We never had a chance. Not really. They were inside our heads, inside our boats. They knew where we were every second. It was like fighting ghosts. The British veteran wanted to speak up, wanted to explain it wasn't ghosts, just technology, just physics, just men doing their jobs. But he stayed silent, because maybe the old German submariner was right in a way. Maybe it was ghosts, the ghosts of physics, the ghosts of sound waves that couldn't be seen or heard, but could still kill you. The veteran finished his beer and left. He never told anyone about that conversation, never wrote it down. But for the rest of his life, he thought about it. About the thin line between technology and magic. About how terrifying it must have been to fight an enemy you couldn't understand. About how sound became the weapon that won the Atlantic. And about the 30,000 German submariners who died, never quite knowing why they couldn't stay hidden anymore. The pings still echo in recordings, preserved in archives, audio from wartime engagements, ASDIC operators calling out contacts, the mechanical pulse of sonar, the methodical tracking of invisible targets. If you listen closely, you can hear history changing. One ping at a time, one echo at a time, one submarine at a time, until the ocean wasn't dark anymore, until sound became sight, until the hunters became the hunted, and the weapon that won the Atlantic wasn't a gun or a bomb or a torpedo. It was a ping, just a ping, echoing through the darkness, finding what couldn't hide.